Okay, so ever since the Nintendo Direct about a week ago, I keep thinking about Metroid Prime 4. Well, more than usual. While everyone else is hyper-focused on the new bike, my mind keeps wandering back to the new trailer visuals. Opinions on the graphics in this latest trailer seem to be all over the place, from praise to criticism to confusion, or just the sense that something is off. So in this video, we'll dig deep and try to answer burning questions about this latest trailer. Were the graphics actually downgraded? Why do the visuals sometimes look great and sometimes not, or a little bit off? And of course, what's actually happening with the bike segments? And as a quick side note, the channel is so close to 5,000 subscribers, so a big thank you to existing supporters, and if you haven't already, please consider helping us hit that milestone. Now, after extensive consideration, I think almost all of the graphical strengths and weaknesses of the trailer primarily boil down to two factors, which are color and scene selection. For whatever reason, almost every single clip in this trailer is dominated by a monochromatic color palette. For simplicity, in the context of this video, that means very close shades of browns, grays, or so on, and no, this isn't a color theory video. Anyway, I think that's why visually Prime 4 sometimes looks great here depending on the scene, but can also look a bit flat or odd when compared to its own earlier trailers and even Metroid Prime Remastered. Let's start with the first-person sections. They start out strong when Samus leaps into action. I think this is probably the best-looking part of the trailer. We have this pool of hot water or lava over on the left with green-screened consoles and these big pipes with highlights running through them. There's a glowing entrance beckoning us closer, there's hot streaks through the rocks, and lava dramatically pours from a large pipe. If we compare this shot to a similar type of clip from an earlier trailer, I think they look very comparable. This is all encouraging. In the next clip, though, my points about color and scene selection start to surface. This area is strangely almost completely uniform grayish-brown across all surfaces. The metallic structure is the same color as the ground. Or these pipes off to the left and the machinery above them, everything is the same color. Sure, this area is rocky and industrial, but it's not so windy and covered in sand that all surfaces should look the same. The sky is also just a uniform orange. When we compare that to a similar shot from the treehouse presentation, we can see a stark difference. I think this scene looks great. The metallic plates on the ground are clearly a different color and texture than the rocks. The fortress up ahead is a mix of metals and a transparent dome. The sky is blue and gray with these bright highlights. Or even if we compare this to a similar rocky compound in the Phazon mines of Metroid Prime Remastered, there's just way more variety in the rocky surfaces and materials, as well as more structural detail. I also think there's something off about this scene in general. For whatever reason, it seems to have lower quality textures and lighting when compared to that other shot, especially on the rocks. The shape definition and materials on this container are also strange, and even textures such as Samus's arm cannon look off. The shapes and lines are not as defined or smooth as other clips even in this same trailer. This is one scene that actually does look noticeably worse than earlier previews, but almost in a more unfinished or rushed way. Perhaps this will still receive some polish. Anyway, in this next scene, we see the inside of the facility, which I think looks fine. However, the walls and floors are all very similar colors again. There aren't any visual highlights or different looking materials across the surfaces. If it weren't for the red lights on the machines, there would be almost no color variation at all in this shot beyond medium browns. Curiously, Samus's arm cannon looks much better with smoother lines and geometry, even though this clip seems to be shortly after the previous scene. But when we compare this to a facility interior from an earlier trailer, we can see a stark contrast, literally. This shot is full of detail and color highlights, such as blues and greens on the consoles, fire in the background, and different types of metal with paint lines and so on. There's much more interesting baked lighting with stronger contrast and seemingly higher quality shadows. Even other interior scenes that are also mostly empty look much better in earlier footage and seem to have higher quality lighting and textures, such as this cool looking corridor. All of this might be intentional and make sense in the context of the game as you reach more bleak areas, but it feels like Nintendo chose an odd collection of clips for this trailer. This next Blizzard scene is all intentionally uniform colors, obviously, and I think in isolation it looks pretty good. However, this particular scene again doesn't help with the monochromatic color trend of the trailer. Earlier previews of the game showcased enemies with multicolor patterns that stood out from their environments. Again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the wolves or the snow being white, I'm just saying this contributes to the color palette uniformity everywhere throughout this trailer, and I think this might be subconsciously throwing people off as they watch. In this later scene, which looks like an interesting Lemorne temple of some sort, the structure in front of Samus is again almost entirely one color of a pinkish white. There are some purple highlights here, but they're very muted. I do like the trippy background, and I think it helps make the scene more intriguing. But when we compare this to a Lemorne area from the story reveal trailer, again, there's just a huge difference in terms of color variety, and in this case, material complexity and environmental detail. I understand these are two different types of environments in these trailers, but my point is just that the new trailer has so many scenes of uniform visuals. Samus's suit itself looks as good as always, so this is another shot that makes me think some of these areas are either unfinished or rushed, rather than experiencing any sort of actual technical limitation or downgrade. In this icy cave shot, almost everything is of similar colors again. The metal is the same color as the ice, the floor is the same color as the walls. However, in terms of pure visual fidelity, I think this scene actually looks pretty good with some moody lighting, transparent surfaces, and decently high quality textures and shadow work. Though when we compare that to a scene from the Phendrana Drifts in Prime Remastered, there's still just much more color variety and environmental highlights to be found. Retro originally found a way to kind of punctuate the white drifts with memorable highlights and different types of surfaces. It's possible Prime 4 has plenty of that, but it's just not shown in this tiny snapshot of a trailer. In this clip of a larger canyon of some sort, the entire scene uses a gray color palette. This is sort of an interesting one for me because I actually really like this scene thematically. I think Samus's arm cannon looks great, and I love this idea that the environment impacts the appearance of her suit, and she's possibly holding her hand up because the wind is so strong. However, these spinning devices, the walls, the path, they all look very similar in terms of color and materials. I think just adding some subtle color variety or some visual interest to these structures would go a long ways. In this case, it does make sense to some degree with snow and wind everywhere that colors would be similar and muted, but again, it just contributes to the pattern of the trailer, regardless whether it looks good or bad. Earlier trailers managed to squeeze a ton of variety out of the Switch in terms of color and surface types. For example, I think the forest or jungle areas look really great. Even though it's all one consistent type of green-dominated scenery, there's still a variety of greens and yellows and purples and purple accents and such. A snowy area can still have different shades of whites and blues and other color flavors. The Phendrana Drifts again had sort of similar environments, but we can see much more variety here in both the color palette and the surface types. This pattern of monochromatic colors and odd clip selection extends to other parts of the trailer. In the early scenes, all of the structures shown here are completely uniform in color. There's no points of interest or variety, even this ramp is the same color. There is at least an interesting contrast with the skies behind them. If we compare this to one of the distant forest views from an earlier trailer, we can see how much more color variety and points of interest there are. In this shot, we have the soft gray browns and blue highlights of the structure, and the forest with a variety of greens and the pale yellow sunlight on the right. Compositionally, this is just a more dynamic and colorful shot, which makes for more interesting trailer material. This tower area actually reminds me a bit of Skytown on Elysia in Prime 3, but even a comparison there reveals a more dynamic color palette in the older game. The floating cylindrical structures aren't just uniform brown, they have intricate shades of white and reddish or dark browns set against a sky of mixed yellows and oranges. This subtle detail and variety is what brings immersive environments to life. And finally, one more example, this shot of the big room where Samus faces Sylux, almost everything here is again the same color. Although this is obviously a cinematic of some sort, in my opinion, these machines almost look unfinished. It's odd that they're almost completely uniform in color palette throughout and along the walls. So essentially my point here is that technically speaking, these areas are all still impressive for Switch hardware, just like earlier trailers. But artistically speaking, unlike earlier trailers, the selected clips are sort of a strange mix and feature monochromatic visuals. They lack the striking art direction of earlier samples to bring the environments to life. I'm hoping this means that once we get a wider view of the game, it'll still look as fantastic as the earlier preview footage and Beyond Prime Remastered. Hopefully Nintendo really did just select some of the more bland parts of otherwise interesting environments, which wouldn't surprise me at all based on the minimal effort they've put into Prime 4 marketing. Now let's talk about the open desert region and the bike. I think the same two factors, color and scene choice, again play a major role here. For example, in terms of color, in the introductory clip where Samus rides the bike out, this structure is almost entirely the same shade of brown or even the same texture with no variation, aside from a couple dim lighting glows. Then in multiple desert shots here, there is almost no color variation across the surfaces. There are no rocks of different shades of brown or gray or different compositions of sand. Even the distant cliffs and larger rock formations are a very similar color as the ground. These scenes might look more interesting if the cliffs were a dark gray, or there were red or black rocks sticking out of the ground, or just something for more contrast. Obviously, a desert is going to feature many similar sandy brown colors, but strong art direction finds a way to add interest or personality. Remember, even in Metroid Prime Remastered, the barren Chozo ruins still have a surprising amount of color and detail variety to keep things interesting. There are two clips of the bike in this trailer that I think also prove my points here. The first is when we initially see the camera pull back behind Samus driving. I think this shot looks significantly better than the rest of the desert views for the very reasons I've described. There is more color here between the purple and yellows in the sky, the lens flares, closer shots of Samus and the bike for red and purple, as well as the forest off to the right. It's more interesting because it looks like she's actually speeding off to one of the environments in the distance. When you compare that to a flat desert shot with less color and no horizon of interest, the difference is very noticeable. And second, when Samus is riding through this area with the towers again, this looks significantly more interesting than anything in the desert, particularly when the lightning strikes. This scene has a combination of dark and light pink skies, yellow highlights in the dark towers, Samus's purple bike stands out. I think this just looks significantly more interesting than the desert because of composition and color. Nintendo really selected odd camera angles in general for the desert, perhaps to hide further details of the game. All of these shots take place out in the middle of nowhere. We don't get to see closer shots of the entrances to these different regions at the edges of the desert, or even investigate points of interest scattered across the sands. This also contributes to that feeling that all of the shots are compositionally similar to one another, so it's possible the desert will look better as you approach different areas, assuming it is a hub of some sort. Now there's a couple other points here that I don't think are getting enough consideration. Yes, this open area is most likely greatly limited by the Switch 1 hardware, but I think the reason it might look especially rough is that Retro historically targets 60 frames per second for these games. Most open-world Switch games struggle to even hit 30 FPS, and that's on foot. So rapidly streaming in an open world at 60 FPS might be crushing the amount of detail or points of interest they're able to add to the environment. Now it is possible that the Switch 1 version ends up running at 30 FPS in the desert and maybe 60 FPS in other areas. I think that's unlikely since retro games have always run at 60, but we'll see. Personally, I'm also guessing Retro chose to make this area a desert so that it's less dense and an open hub area like this is even possible. Prime 4 is still running on an amped up version of the original Prime engine, so I'm also wondering if the engine just doesn't have strong open world features built into it. Perhaps it lacks advanced environment streaming or level of detail features necessary to introduce a more detailed open world. One other miscellaneous item I want to touch on is the game file size. Interestingly, Prime 4 on Switch is supposedly 31.6 gigabytes, while the Switch 1 version is about 28.9. This is an interesting number to me because it implies the Switch 2 upgrades are there, but they are probably modest overall. Both games use the same engine and have the same content, so the file size difference is probably mostly due to texture resolution and perhaps higher resolution cinematics, and maybe some minor assets and code for extra Switch 2 features. It's hard to say how big of an impact a few gigabytes will have on the overall game assets or visuals. Did Retro just spend time really polishing up the early areas of the game for demos and marketing, or are those level of updates spread evenly over the entire game, and is this just a poor showcasing in the latest trailer? As a side note, this file size also implies that Prime 4 is a massive game, which gives me hope that there's still plenty of awesome content yet to be revealed. The file size is 50% larger than even Tears of the Kingdom on Switch 2. Interestingly, Tears of the Kingdom on Switch 2 is about 3 gigabytes bigger than on Switch 1, which is the same gap we see with cross-gen Prime 4. This suggests Prime 4 overall will be a similar upgrade in visuals to what we saw with Tears of the Kingdom, overall slightly higher resolution textures and frame rate. But as we saw with Tears of the Kingdom, that difference actually can be revolutionary to the experience, so I'm excited to see how Switch 2 performs overall. It's also worth noting Prime 4 is about 5 times larger than Prime Remastered, which is only 6 gigabytes. Obviously the core of Prime Remastered was originally a GameCube game, but it did use the same engine and all visual assets were replaced, so it's still kind of shocking to me that the file size of Prime 4 is 5 or 6 times larger. That alone contributes to my hype for this game. I hope it's just a vast world to explore, and I think people are underestimating the potential and size here. So what are your thoughts? What do you think of the visuals or this analysis? Please hit those subscribe and like buttons, leave a comment, and let's discuss.